Diaspora is a very broad category that can fit any number of expectations and I think aspirations and ambitions for both for writers and for readers. It's become such an important topic for so many writers and also for so many of us as readers today. Various forms of dislocation, such as exile, diaspora, and migration, have been extensively explored in the works of the authors that we welcome today. Diaspora has undeniably brought about profound changes in the makeup of the world. The past century has seen such large-scale displacement as a result of war and decolonization, and changes followed apace in recent decades with globalization, spurred in particular by free trade and the flow of capital, as well as new communication, information, and travel technologies. These have all led to an acceleration of people, ideas, and cultures across the world, which have all left their mark on literature. Diaspora is, of course, quite varied. There is movement that is a result of involuntary migration and exile, as well as self-choice. Our writers who join us today consider a host of questions associated in one way or another with the broad rubric of diaspora, from multiculturalism and identity to the various ways that cosmopolitanism is being remade and rethought, as well as consciousness as to history and as to language, which I think we'll really be able to get into today. I'm very happy to welcome all four of our panelists. I'm just going to very quickly introduce them. Begin at the end. Cormac James is the author of 2 novels in his book, The Surfacing, which I have in uncorrected proofs, but you can buy a bound copy of after our discussion today. It's just been published by this month by Bellevue Literary Press. This is his North American debut novel. He was born in Cork, Ireland, and now makes his home in Montpellier, France, where he lives with his wife and son. Next to him is Abdourahman Waberi. He's the author of numerous novels and is an accomplished essayist as well. His books, available in English translation, include Transit, which is published by Indiana University Press, Passage of Tears, which is the one example I brought in today. It would have weighed down my book bag too much to bring in too many examples, which was published by Siegel Press, and The United States of Africa, which was published by Bison Books, University of Nebraska Press. A native of Djibouti, he moved to France when he was 20 to study literature and has lived and taught in France and the United States since. He's currently a professor at George Washington University. He's received awards too numerous to list on this occasion, but I'll give you 2, the Stéphane Guillaume Prize and the Grand Prix Littéraire d'Afrique Noire. Next to Abdul is Kerry Young. Kerry Young is the author of 2 novels, Pow and Gloria. I'm showing the earlier of the 2, Pow. These are both published by Bloomsbury. She was born in Kingston, Jamaica, to a Chinese father and a mother of mixed Chinese-African heritage. She moved to England at the age of 10. Her debut novel, Pow, was shortlisted for the Costa First Novel Award and the Commonwealth Book Prize. She lives in, it's always hard with these foreign names, like Leicestershire, sorry, Leicestershire, England. Apologies. Finally, Rashidah Ismaili, and I'm going to hold up her most recent book, is the author of numerous poetry collections of plays, and most recently the novel and stories autobiography The Laurie's Side, published by Northampton House Press. Her work is included in the landmark anthology Heinemann Book of African Women's Poetry. She was born and raised in Cotonou, Benin, and holds a PhD in ethnotherapy and psychodrama from the Herbert Holt Institute for Psychotherapy. She has taught extensively in the United States, so it's a pleasure to welcome all of you. You come from such different backgrounds and such different experiences. I thought it might be a good idea to just start by asking about your kind of local experiences as writers. You're all in some ways exemplars of literary migration, whether it involves a move from Benin to the United States, from Jamaica to the UK, from Djibouti or Ireland to France. These are reflected in vastly different ways in your work, and I wonder if you might reflect for a minute on the autobiographical models of diaspora literature and what kind of influence writers of the diasporic writers might have had on your work. And I'll start at the end with you, Cormac. And you come from, as an Irish writer living in France, there are, of course, many examples of Irishmen who have written in French. Why don't you talk about whether that's had an influence on your work?
The 2 kind of monoliths that are difficult to avoid or to not to see are Joyce and Beckett. And they're almost kind of the
Excuse me, could you bring the microphone closer?
Yeah, I think
sure. Sorry.
Thank you.
And they in some ways kind of set the blueprint for the relationship with the mother country, the mother tongue, and of course it's complicated for Irish writers by the relationship that exists already in Ireland between being Irish and speaking an English language, a language that's been brought from without. So those are two very, very strong presences for any Irish writer, be it at home or abroad, and particularly for me, I suppose, having, in some ways replicated their kind of migration from Ireland to France, albeit in very different circumstances. Obviously their relationship with France, with the mother country and the mother tongue, that is very much in the forefront of my mind whenever I even begin to think about the subject.
Abdou, would you move to France when you were age 20, I believe? Mm-hmm. And as you were becoming a writer, you were obviously aware of the strong precedent of Francophone writing from Africa. How is that tradition? How do you think about that tradition when you were beginning as a writer? Was it something that you wanted to emulate, or something you possibly wanted to avoid?
Hello everybody. I'm used to say hello to everybody because I have a grandmother who used to tell me, yes, when you go someplace, you have to say hello, and I want to say hello to each and everybody. I'm used in Europe, and especially in France, that someone can come in a place, talk about literature and philosophy without even acknowledging the people he has in front of him. So I cannot talk without saying hello to somebody. And my mom used to say, you can say hello to the trees. It's not just politeness, it's just, I don't know, some twist of mind. I will describe someone who is coming from a periphery of a periphery. Even in Africa, I come from a periphery. I came in a very small place called Djibouti. I was born to a modest household where we speak only Somali. I was the first one who got to college, became literate in the Franca language of the place, French. At the age of 20, I came normally to France without having the hustle and bustle that we have now with Sarkozy and all those politics. Because at that time, which is going back to 85, it was quite normal for young Djiboutian to go to Marseille, Paris, or Aix-en-Provence, and because this was the country was only 8 years old, and very quickly I kind of even became African in France. This is the first irony, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where I became aware of my, how do you say, periphericness. I'm meaning by that, when I was in the studying in Caen, Normandy, this was the first time that I met with a whole host of African brothers, friends, from Benin to Côte d'Ivoire.
And this is Pan-African.
Yeah, and then I was playing soccer with my friends. So this is okay. This is now I'm in the UA, because when I was in Djibouti, I was actually defining myself as a Djiboutian. I know Ethiopians, but I was not aware of Ghanaians and Guineans, right? And so this was, and coming to the literature, and I will not hold the mic. I was also aware of coming from this periphery, and I was using the legacy of the forefathers within the Francophone. For example, just to give you an example, says Senghor was living not far at that time, and I went here. I reached out for him and even tried to give him some poetry. And so I was aware that I was bringing something brand new in Djibouti, because we were. I was very, let's say, in an egotic way. I'm kidding, but I'm just saying I have to put Djibouti also in a literary place, because we don't have that. And I guess that was the birth of my writing consciousness. And luckily for me, I became, I do my contribution from the literary. I'm not still living in Djibouti. I cannot live in Djibouti in the coming years. But anyhow, this is the way I navigate, and this is the way I bring Djibouti to the literary place, and even to NYU, so thank you.
Thanks. Kerry, I mean, you have such an interesting background. I'm curious how you kind of came to consciousness as a writer. You span so many different worlds, and you also are writing about a place that I think is probably not terribly well known, China in Jamaica.
Well, I think Jamaica is quite, well, we are.
No, Jamaica is, but I think the Chinatown Jamaica may not be.
But, I mean, the thing is that, of course, I went to England when I was very young. I was 10 years old, and at that point, I wasn't aware of being Jamaican. I wasn't aware of that until I went to England. So, in a sense, I became Jamaican in England. And I was young, and I didn't, so when I started to read, it didn't make sense for me, the British writers, you know, the Jane Austen and the Charles Dickens that was being forced upon me at that age. That didn't seem to relate to me whatsoever. And as I grew, the writers who I became attracted to, actually Black American writers, Baldwin, and then later Alice Walker, and when I decided to write Powell, it was because I decided that I wanted to write a work of fiction. I'd written a lot of non-fiction before, and I wanted to prove to myself that I could write a work of fiction that someone would publish. So that was the challenge. And when I thought about what I wanted to write about, it was Jamaica, because that was still in my heart. And then, so, well, what are you going to write about? So you write about what you know. So people are always asking me how much Pow is autobiographical. And when my mum read Pow, the first drafts of Pow, she said, I can see where you got the idea from, but your father wasn't anywhere near as clever. Or as successful, or as funny.
Very quickly, what the subject of Pow and Gloria is. That might also help.
That might also help. So Pow, the subject of Pow's 14 years old, he's Chinese, he goes to Jamaica.
And it's a historical novel.
Yeah, in 1938 he goes to Jamaica and he rises up to become the boss of Chinatown. So that's what Pow's about. And then the second book, Gloria, is Pow's mistress, who's African heritage. And the third book that comes out next year is Faye, the wife, who's Chinese heritage. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to show the different Jamaicas. I wanted to show the poor Jamaica, Gloria's poor Jamaica, and the rich Jamaica, that is Faye's Jamaica, and the different ways in which those different communities interact, and to show that there is a Chinese community in Jamaica, which of course lots of people don't know, especially in the UK. Everyone thinks of Jamaicans as being African heritage. Yeah. You know, in Canada and here in the States, there are many more Chinese Jamaicans, but not in the UK so much. But I think the person that really, in terms of the question about writers, is when Toni Morrison said about something about writing or not writing for the white gaze, I think that influenced me hugely in the writing of Pow and Gloria and Faye, because I just wanted to tell our story. I didn't want to educate the white reader. So it's written in patois. Yeah. And I was just writing our story for us. The fact that it's had so much international success has come as something of a surprise to me, quite frankly.
Well, I want to return in a little bit just to that question about both for everyone about the audience, but also about the language that you use in the novel, about the sort of problems of writing your characters. So let's keep that in mind. I was curious though. There has been a lot of interest, I think, recently in writers from the Caribbean in the 50s and 60s in the UK, and particularly I see that there's a lot of interest in Sam Selvin and figures like that. I'm curious if that was someone you were ever engaged, or someone like Naipaul. Were they of interest in? Yes, right, the great Guyanese writer.
Yes, absolutely, and but it's of men's experience. Right. And if you think of the Lonely Londoners, it's of men's experience. So I was trying to understand what women's experience is, and because politically, I mean, the books are very political books. I don't like to stress that, because then people think, oh no, they're very serious, because they are very serious, and they're also not very serious. But they are very political books, and I wanted to understand the politics, the gender politics. Before I was involved in writing fiction, I was involved in youth work in the UK, and there were issues as a youth worker that I was involved in, issues of class, race, gender, sexuality, all of those issues, and I wanted to bring those issues to the fore in my work, fiction work as well. So the books are about Pow, you know, doing all his shenanigans downtown Kingston, Chinatown, but they're also about race and gender and class and sexuality and those issues through those times.
Mhm.
You have you 38 to early 1980s power runs through those times in Jamaica, and to reflect on my thoughts about the politics of those issues in that place at that time,
Mhm.
and how it impacted on people's lives. So yeah.
Well, I think of, just a segue, I think of the autobiography that you've written of a different time in New York as being also very political, and you were obviously very involved in the Black Arts Movement. Do you want to talk about that, about how you came to write the current book?
Yes, but just before that, when we're talking about diaspora, this book is probably I think it's out of print. I actually saw it on Amazon, and I was really disgusted that because it's limited now, they're charging. You can't imagine me. I wouldn't pay that much for it. But anyway, Onyibo is a term that's in Yoruba, and it means
Can't hear.
Oh, I'm sorry.
okay. The term Onyibo means it's a derogatory term for white people, but it comes about during the time of slave getting. It now refers to people who put on airs, who have been to and come back, and we call them Masoso Bintu. They've been to Europe, so in Pidgin we call it Bintu. And it's also a put down. Sometimes they interchange this word for that. I wrote this book here. I don't think I could have written it in Africa. But at the same time, what the two of you are saying about how you become how your identity really comforts you and supports you in a strange place. You start to write from that kind of place. So from Onyibo, which is one of my first publications here, to autobiography of the Lower East Side, I think what is happening in at least what I conceived of in that book was to talk about how I was on the Lower East Side, in that environment, in that artist community, interacting with people, but at the same time sort of being an observer. And I think that sometimes a writer is very often an observer or who sees a situation. The politics of the Lower East Side in the late 50s and 60s is very much a part of what was going on. Many of the people who were in the writers' organization that later became Black Arts Movement, expanded to Black Arts Movement, Umbra in particular. So those characters, of the chapters or the streets, was a way of trying to create a composite of character, but within the political framework. It was during the time when Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. He was captured in '60, and he was killed in '61. It was the time of JFK, who really, in many ways, I mean, later it becomes JFK. And so I wanted to have the external, the world politics being reflected on the locale of the Lower East Side, which already had a kind of historical, political life. I mean, you had tremendous anarchists, you had tremendous amounts of quote leftists, the old Jewish communists. I don't know if they're aristocracy, but certainly the vanguard of them were on the Lower East Side. You had Italian anarchists, you had a Russian. I mean, it was a very interesting place because you could go on one street you would hear Czech. You go on another street, you hear Ukrainian. You go on another street, you hear Russian. You go on another street, you hear polyglot of Spanish and English. And then that is imposed on an area that was in fact an African village because it was outside the municipality of New York City. And Africans could not live inside the municipality after dark. So that whole slither around this island, you will find remnants of African peoples. And so that's the kind of, I guess, politics and culture that I wanted to bring so that the Lower East Side doesn't become seen only as a place where European immigrants come and are contained there, although that happened, but they are on top of they're on top of a structure that is already there, which is very seldom referred to.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That's true. What year did you?
I was there in from 58 till maybe about 62, 63, and then I moved to the quote village proper. But we didn't necessarily call this Lower East Side at that time. This was Alphabet City. I was on 10th Street between C and D, and that was called Alphabet City.
I don't think anybody calls it Alphabet City anymore.
And nobody calls it that anymore.
Yeah, they used to. Well, Kerry brought up the issue of the audience in this really interesting way, and I'm curious. Do you have an ideal reader that you're writing this book for? Do you have someone in mind?
Oh yes.
Do you have a picture of this reader sitting down with the book?
I have two readers in mind. The first are collectively my grandparents, and that means that I want those old people who are unlettered, who are illiterate, but not unintelligent, to read/hear what I'm saying, because I believe that I'm talking to them, and a lot of the language that I'm using, no matter what the form it takes, whether it's French, English, or whatever, that the language that I'm using, they understand and they can hear me. The second audience is primarily an audience of African people. And by that I mean both Africa and the African diaspora. Those are my primary audiences. It does not mean that Europeans, people of European descent or Asian descent, should not or cannot read and hopefully enter my work. But I believe it's very important for people who look like me to see themselves in my work, and for them to accept or not, like or dislike, but at least to know that I appreciate and I have learned and I have heard the stories and the things that they have said and experienced, and that I value it and I put it on paper.
Mm-hmm. Abdul, I'm curious if you have any reaction to that, a response. Also, you might think of as your kind of ideal reader, if you even think about that.
Actually, I could have taken every word what the sister said. This is the ideal reader, who is someone, I imagine someone who I know, who is someone from my shantytown, because I was born and raised in the Bidonville, the Djibouti shantytown. And to give you an example, my first novel was entitled Balbala, and Balbala it's a poor neighborhood. It's a shantytown of a shantytown, kind of. And the funny thing is that when I go back to Djibouti now, and sometimes as a big man, and I see someone else who has taken a bus, who has had a long ride, and say, I just want to say hello to the guy who wrote a book called Balbala. And I say, oh, funny. But now, having also lived in almost my more than 25 years in Europe, so I don't now see any, I don't have this now, I guess. as if I have done my first debt, you know,
Yeah.
and have given back to Djibouti.
Right.
So now I can write to anybody
Exactly.
who can decipher, I say,
Right.
some French. And now actually I'm even blessed and have some 8 languages and some books in English too. But it's as if my childhood debt was given back. You know, I'm kind of freed from the dynamics of my country and my shantytown, how do you say, legacy or relationship.
Was that a liberating experience as a writer, to feel that you were writing for a different, that you know, like you said, you paid back?
Yeah, I don't know why, because I guess because I'm coming from, as I said, from this unprivileged background, I was feeling it was, no one was saying something to me, they don't even care about reading in French. It's just that I felt, me as a young man from that area, that I have to give back them, you know, and it took me, when I was writing in Normandy, it was very tough, and I wrote a book on Rwanda. It was the same thing, you know. I wrote a book on testimony on the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda, and I was feeling again this same kind of, you know, debt that I have to give back to the people that have shared some stories, because we were 8 years of the genocide of Tutsi in Rwanda, and people were just giving stories. And the funny thing is that as an academic, they're giving me is very sound advices. One example was never don't write. You say you are a writer. Yes, I say I'm only fiction writer. I say, oh, this is not serious, right? You have to be a historian. You don't have to how do you say trivialize our burden and our, you know. So they were giving me technical questions, and that's actually in Kigali I became aware how I have to take more seriously my job and say, yes, I have done the testimony from Djibouti and so on and so forth, but now I'm on a different territory, and a territory where there have been almost lives of 1 million people have been claimed, so I don't have to, I'm not yet, yes, I'm not a Tutsi, I'm not a Rwandan, but at the meantime there are a couple of people, maybe a handful of people who have shared something to me directly, and they were very meaning and saying, we're watching you, right? You don't have to trivialize our burden, and you don't have to, because we did, at the same time they're using metaphor, like, you know, there was the year of the craziness, and, you know, everything was a havoc, and everything was running amok, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, when they're talking to you, they were saying, be a historian. You used to have at least the seriousness of a historian, and maybe the lightness of a fiction writer. And I guess I learned something, but you know how, let's say, put it this way, my guilt is now gone, and I can write to anyone who can decipher a few French.
Well, you really parody the banalities in the United States of Africa, which is a really interesting book, and sort of turns on its head the kinds of things that
Yeah.
written about Africa in the Western press.
I was sick and tired from what I call the expertise take, you know, and say we can explain everything on ethnicism and blah blah blah, and say even in the you're from the Yoruba land, so which is bigger, but even in the Somali land, it's complicated. As you say, we have 5 colonialism, one of which is African. We call colonialism because it's Ethiopia, and if you go back to some, let's say, Afrocentric places, when you say Ethiopia, I mean Abyssinia is a colonizer for me. This is becoming complicated. But anyhow, that was just making fun of what I call the expertise take.
Yeah. It's interesting also that, so this is not really your case, Abdou, but so many of you also wrote historical novels, and I'm wondering if there's a particular kind of, well, I know with Kerry and Cormac's books both, you have provided very interesting research notes in the back, or at least a syllabus or a bibliography that could help the reader to understand what you're writing about more. And I'm just wondering if you want to reflect on that in any way.
I wanted to place the characters in their context, in their time, and so there's a lot of historical information that's included in both, well, in all 3 books. That's correct political information. So I mean, and the whole timing of it. So Howe starts 1938, which is when the first political party, People's National Party, was established in Jamaica, and then it runs through, you know, when we got the vote and the West Indies Federation, and then later independence, and the first Manley government, the second Manley government. So it runs up to when Siaga becomes Prime Minister. So that period was chosen because for me that was a very important turning point. I know it's a long period, but it runs up to early 1980s. So that's a very important turning point politically in my view, for Jamaica. So that I wanted to get all those historical events right and provide in the back of the book the references for those, because I came from an academic background, and when you've done that, you've done the PhD and all the rest of it, there's a tendency to want to put the references in. So I really wanted to put the references in, and Bloomsbury went, no, this is fiction now, we're not doing that now, don't put references in. I was like, I can't do that, we have to put a list of sources. So we did do that in Power, and then when we came to Gloria, they said, oh look, this is fiction, we really don't need all of that in the back. So I said, okay, but I actually regretted that. So in the next book, it will have a list of sources. Because I think it's important to help the reader understand what was happening, because we don't just, as human beings, we don't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
We exist in a particular political, social, economic context. And that context affects our lives and the way we see our lives and the decisions that we make about our lives. So I wanted to contextualize the people, and so that's why that's on there.
It also perhaps comes back to what you were saying a couple of seconds ago about the notion that to fictionalize it is to trivialize form, that it's just telling stories, that it's somehow a lesser form of conveying information, which of course is it's not true at all. Often it's a more complex one, or it tells things or renders the experiences that can't be given in a fact-based historical account, for example. Also, I thought it was very interesting something you were saying just a little earlier about being in a home or a culture kind of away from your origins, and the notion of, or the feeling of being slightly outside, something of an observer, as though you're participating, but you're just perhaps pretending, and actually you're seeing with maybe a slightly more objective eye certain things that are going on that people who might be have lived and grown up in the place wouldn't be aware of.
Does that kind of ethnographic model still function for everyone?
I don't know. I mean, the thing that it made me think of is that also the relationship that you have when you go away to where you came from. When you go back to visit, or even from a distance, you also have that that sense of being an outsider, being a bit of an observer. You're going back to the place that you grew up. You're dealing with the people, your friends, your family, and yet you're behind the pane of glass a little bit sometimes. And I suppose for me, that notion of going away, of leaving the culture, the context that you grew up in, it isn't always a negative thing, because okay, you leave your culture, the social structure, and so on that formed you, but you also leave your family, you leave your friends, and those influences are not always fully positive as well. Sometimes that's something you need to get away from, to stand back, to turn around, and then from that position describe, maybe with a little bit more objectivity, a little bit less love or investment, that, and often it's the people who go away who paint the portraits that are most telling of the societies they came from.
Yeah, that's very well.
You were saying, for instance, you can't go back to Djibouti now at the moment, and you're also giving an account of the different ideas of colonization and so on. Could somebody who's still living in Djibouti voice those views, or would it be a little more difficult for them than it is for you?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if I have not gone out of Djibouti, I wouldn't have been the same guy. You know, so I'm getting the point. Also, Cormac was saying is that I wrote some times ago what I call a eulogy for exile, a prize for exile, and saying that sometimes exile is also good because it gives us a different mindset. I would have, for example, you can be rush back to your culture because some of the idiosyncrasies, or even sometimes some of the blockade coming from your own culture you don't have when you are inside. You cannot voice out that obstacles and that difficulties. And the fact that we all of us have been living outside is that we became now outsiders, insiders. You know, we have this, if you want to talk about the ethnologists, you have this kind of, you know, I call that the chameleon eye. You know, I can see from inside and outside at the same time, these gymnastics. And I have been the one who have written more, I mean the most on Djibouti, and at the same time, some of the official Djibouti considers me as one of the enemy, because I just say also it's a dictatorship, it's not it's a hell place, you know, we don't have to say 24 hours Djibouti is cool, you know. It's some people are not living very, I couldn't even leave, I couldn't see my mom, so it is also a very problematic situation, and I have this, you know, discussion. It's sometimes exhausting to have, you know, this chameleon eye, and sometimes I just feel like I will be at peace in Normandy or now in DC area, just say I don't even write on Djibouti. But and one last thing that I would say on the price of the exile is that you choose your own family, kind of, you know. You can choose, you know, identify with a Black America. You have any, you know. I sometimes think that when I was a student, I have a huge love what I call to my two Edwards, and one Edward was here or not far from here. We will have a tribute to him. It's Edouard Glissant. And the other guy was Edouard Said, so I think those two Edwards were my grandfathers. If I have just remained in Djibouti, I would have known my two Edwards. Yeah. I just know from distance, but anyhow, these were at some point my forefathers, and I have chosen because they were experiencing for me the path of, you know, this complicated, postmodern, cosmopolitan, difficult, you know, life that we are all from some places, and we are all from, at the same time, the same world and the same humanity, and we also forget that we have some huge communalities, and we're always talking about our small differences.
I had an interesting experience recently. I went to England at the age of 10, so I was young, and as I said earlier, I kind of had a sense of myself as Jamaican, so I felt always as an outsider, as an observer in England. And when POW came out, and a lot of interviewers asked me why I always refer to Jamaica as home, because I always say Jamaica home, even though I've been in England this very long time. And in the end, they said, at what point will you call Britain home? And I said, when the British stop asking me where I'm from. But an interesting thing happened recently. I went to China on vacation. And I don't know whether it was because I'd written right to run the visa application, or whether because that week on Google, if you Googled me that week, what you would have found was everything about Kerry Young, my photo, reviews of the books. And in the middle of it, it said, Kerry tells Chinese government to stop persecuting the 5 feminists they've got in prison. And I was horrified when I saw that. It turned out to be John Kerry. But whether that was an influential feature or not, what happened is that I picked up the attention of the Chinese police. And actually it was quite terrifying to be under that level of surveillance. When you think you're on vacation, to be followed to the extent that we were followed, room searches, all sorts of quite terrifying things, and they didn't interfere with us, but one did have the feeling that you were being, you know, we'd planned our itinerary, and we were being kept on that itinerary as we went down the country and eventually flew out to Shanghai, but you were constantly aware of the surveillance that you were under.
Yeah.
And when I actually got on the Virgin Atlantic flight in Shanghai to leave, I realized how much, well, I think I realized it along the way, but I realized how much having that British passport had helped me feel safe in that set of circumstances, because the thing that I kept telling myself is, well, they can watch, but they can't actually do anything to me because I've got a British passport. And I think since then, and that was like 3 weeks ago, my sense of my identity as Jamaican and as British is change. And I think the next time I'm asked the question, why do you always call Jamaica home and you never call Britain home, I think I'll have to have a different answer, because it was the British passport that in my head, because nothing actually happened, but in my head it was the British passport, it was being British that made me feel safe in a way that I think if I'd been traveling on a Jamaican passport, I don't think I would have felt safe in the same way.
Yeah, oh, that's fascinating. That's really interesting. We're running so close to the 1 o'clock hour that it's a good time to take questions. Why don't we take, let me see, and forgive me because I can't look in both directions at once, but maybe we'll take, we'll pass the mic here and take your question. And do we have anyone on this wing who wants to ask a question? Go ahead. And in the front, yeah.
Thank you, first of all, to the panelists for inspiration and explanation. I'd like to address to Ms. Ismaili. Could you just clarify your statement about referencing the 50s and 60s that African Americans were not able to live because, for example, in the Lower East Side today, Charlie Parker's apartment is commemorated on 10th. And was it just the reference that artists could integrate themselves, or the general population was excluded?
Could you clarify the question? I'm not understanding.
The reference that you made,
Yes.
that African Americans were not permitted to live in all sections of New York, was that referencing the 50s and the 60s?
No,
Okay.
I think it's just-
All right. Okay.
And then why don't we also go ahead and take, do you want to also give us your question and then we'll combine them?
Shall I take the mic?
Yeah,
Just
it's
speak
coming to
loud?
you.
Oh, hello. Yes, thank you so much for your wonderful discussion of diaspora. And I've been reading a little bit about diaspora and have heard that there's kind of this positive aspect of diaspora, and you've touched on it a bit, in terms of this creative renewal of identity through this hybridity, you know, being from one culture, living in another culture, but then discovering your roots. Can you comment on the connection between diaspora and this kind of cultural hybridity?
Okay, so.
Hybridity is a word that I sort of don't like. So it's not a word when it was very popular in the literary jargon. I mean, we go in a cyclical manner, and we suddenly, you know, post-coloniality and historicity. I mean, I mean, in Pidgin, you say, what's I to say? What is it that you're trying to say? Just say it. You know, hybridity. I mean, imagine calling somebody a hybrid. That's or a culture a hybrid. I think diaspora, as I understand the word, much more embraces and contextualizes how a human being comes to be in a place that may not have, quote, his or her origins. So for me, a wonderful term of diaspora is when one says somebody is an African American or an Asian American, but especially an African American, because the American situates the African, but the African begs the question, how come he's an African in America? And then that gets problematic. So diaspora has not been a concept that has been, quote, afforded the African peoples. I'm saying that because it is a complex and accusative situation for the culture and the history of the United States. I embrace the notion of diaspora because I see it as a reality of our complex histories and arrivals. We are here because of a multitude of things that happened historically, and that happened politically, and that happened existentially. But once in a location, once we get room and board and a little bit of sustenance, we reconstitute. And the reconstitution that that we involve ourselves with is based on some notion of a root. In this case, I'm talking about Africa. But understanding and incorporating into that the reality of where you are. So where you are allows you to physically survive, and the combination of your roots and what you can take in now allows you to culturally, I think, spiritually survive. So I don't have a problem with diaspora.
I want to hear everyone on this, but unfortunately, we're actually past 1 o'clock. And
So now we,
Some hand right.
yeah, there's another hand up here. But well,
we should still 15 minutes.
yeah, just for I know we started late. Yeah, let's take one more question here, and then.
Hello.
Yeah, but you don't understand. We need. Something else is about to take place in this.
What's going to
this
happen is
next
the
phase.
music is going to
Sorry,
break up.
let's ask this one more question here, and then we'll.
Thank you all for your presentation. So I'm
go ahead.
getting the generative possibilities of diaspora, but I also want any one of y'all to talk about kind of this notion of decentering diaspora from the Western metropoles, because I see that, I mean, especially you all, it's London, Paris, New York. So when can we start conceiving of Africa or African cities as also possible spaces of diaspora?
She said, I couldn't hear the last part.
Can you repeat the very end of your question again? We're just having a hard time hearing it.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
When can we start conceiving of Africa or places that are on the continent as also metropoles of diaspora, other than London, New York, Paris? You know, because I feel like it's kind of always concentrated in the West.
Do you guys want to tackle this?
I don't understand the question. Could you sort of contextualize? Could you?
No, I'm not quite sure that I could visualize it right that
The
the right
diaspora
way.
doesn't have to be always in the West.
Yeah.
Oh,
I think it's
Yeah,
asking
but
about
diaspora
other
from Africa
diasporas.
to Africa.
Yeah.
I should have taken this.
Can you hear me? Sorry.
We can now. Yeah. Thank you.
At least in the time and space of a novel, I have imagined that in the United States of Africa, where Africa was the place where everything was happening, but that was going to what some call Afrofuturism, and so maybe this is another discussion. But coming to the question of diaspora, someone was also talking about. No one has pronounced the word. I noticed, and the second thing I noticed is that in the French, at least concept, it's different. But maybe I don't know if we might use the creolization terms, which means that it's somehow what is happening nowadays, and everyone is somehow in a creolization condition or creolized condition where we have issues of power, issues of, for example, I also travel because I have a French passport. Because if I were producing my Djiboutian passport, no one would take seriously, right? So yeah, so my emotional. So I have a passport of my emotion, but it's useless, and I have the passport of the reality. And I was feeling the same thing when the Charlie Hebdo issue became. I say maybe I will this time side with also and defend the take on the French Republic and laïcité. So I was defending this Republic and laïcité because it was coming at attack, and I was not always saying, well, I will just say I can somehow lower my voice, my post-colonial voice, and also maybe defend the nation or the nation, the French system, as when it was becoming attacked by some people who was coming from the outside, on using the tools of democracy to unfit the nation.
I was talking about my experience from going to Jamaica to England, because that was my experience. But in terms of the novels, of course, they're set in Jamaica, and that experience is of Africans being taken to Jamaica, and Chinese and Indians being transported by the British to Jamaica. So in terms of your question, it's not from Africa to the West, but from Africa and from China and from India to the Caribbean.
That's really interesting. We are out of time. But before you get up, let me say two things really quickly. All of our authors will be available for further discussion and to sign their books right outside our side door, front door on the views. And I'm not going to take, it's going to, so that we can get out of here in a timely fashion. please pick up one of these brochures because I think everyone on the panel, you've already spoken earlier today, but all of you guys have things coming up this afternoon that you'll definitely want to be part of. And there's a really interesting event tonight celebrating one of the two Granddad Edwards, Edouard Glissant. So you'll want to definitely make sure you can attend that. And the West Beth reading.